local or a global issue. And so based on the article fought very hard for terrorism being a local issue. And almost to a fault that I would say that they didn't present an argument for why it would be global, and they didn't present responses to potential global point of views that could be brought up.
Okay, 1 second, Micah. Now, you're already critiquing the article without letting us know yet what it does say. Because for one thing, I would suggest
said that it was local.
The coverage clearly in the article, though, is global. They're not just talking about one or two countries. What they're saying, right, the data tell us something. It's not just their opinion. Now, this is their interpretation, but it's more than just an opinion. Okay. So now go ahead.
You said, wait, hold up. You said that I didn't respond to the question. I said that it was local, right?
Well, no, what I'm suggesting is that you're supposed to let us know what's in the article that they're saying would lead them to assume that, to the extent that what you're saying is correct. Based on what? Is it just them saying it, or what are they telling us?
Yeah, so yeah, it's kind of later on with Neneko and Ed, but yeah, I can touch on it a little bit.
Well, either that or turn it over to one of your colleagues, if you want. I mean, your assertion so far is, on balance, they're saying, you're saying that they're saying the best way to understand terrorism is as essentially a more local rather than global phenomenon. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So based on what? No, I'm saying, I mean, if you want to turn it over to one of your colleagues now, you can do that.
Yeah, I can touch on that, actually.
Okay.
So overall, it's saying that there was a 27% decrease in deaths from the terrorist attacks. There are about 18,700, so close to 20,000. 70% of those deaths were from 5 countries, and that was Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and Syria. So I think what he was trying to say was like, why it can seem more local is because it was some of the deaths. So these deaths were concentrated on these 5 countries. And then whenever Ed talks, he'll talk about where the majority of the attacks were concentrated on. But majority of the attacks came from those 5 countries, and a majority of the deaths, for being more concentrated, came from Afghanistan. In 2016, there was 4,578 deaths, and then 2017, there were about 4,672. So really, it's, even though, like, you'll see that even though there's a decrease in attacks, there are some increases in deaths as well. So
now, what should we understand? That's an interesting point, that there would be fewer terrorist acts or incidents, and yet more of a higher death toll. Yes. How should we understand that?
So Afghanistan, primarily, there are more deaths in Afghanistan because they have more mass casualty attacks within their country. A lot of that has to do with this, with like the uprising in Afghanistan. So it's kind of like the war between US forces and Afghanistan. So they view the US as more of a foreign threat. Of course, not all of Afghanistan supports, the terrorism. They like the Americans being there. So it's kind of like I feel like the terrorist groups are trying to fight against the US, and they're not trying to fight against the rest of the Afghans that support the US, but in a way have to if they want to. I think they tried calling not the terrorists, but the government tried calling a ceasefire. And I think it went on for like 3 days until the terrorists denied it. They didn't want to do it anymore because they saw it as a sign of weakness. So
when we're talking about, we keep using this generic phrase, the terrorists. Is that a safe thing for us to do, to just assume that, one terrorist is another and they're just terrorists? They're not, I mean, when we, in the United States, when we refer to the military, we almost always use the word hero. I mean, someone can be, a mechanic in the Army, and we're thanking them for their service and calling them a hero. Okay. The rest of the world doesn't see them that way. it isn't necessarily the case that when people see, Americans in desert camo coming toward them, that they're thinking, thank God the heroes are here. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is, just as we cavalierly throw around the term hero, where, it may not apply, are we being equally cavalier with our use of the term terrorist? Why are these people killing people? For example, Afghanistan, I mean, all these deaths, I mean, especially these mass casualty attacks, right? In Afghanistan. Why would that be? I mean, what are these just insane people who are, religious fanatics and hateful subhumans? What's their problem?
They're an insurgency group, so they're trying to overthrow the government. So that's primarily what they're trying to do. So they're trying to gain power in a way that's more forceful, I guess.
Well, wait a minute. When you say gain power in a way that's more forceful,
they try to, and I guess they try to instill, and not, I mean, yeah, I guess they kind of instill fear, but
well, that would be terrorism, yeah.
Yes, they instill fear. Try to instill power as well by killing people, mass casualties, trying to prove a point that they're powerful. And
well, that would suggest that they're forceful. It certainly doesn't suggest that they're powerful, because if they were powerful, the logic goes, they wouldn't have to kill people. Right. I'm trying to devil's advocate. I think it's striking, and we should pay attention to the idea that, the number one hotspot for terrorism right now is a place where the United States has, until recently, been heavily committed militarily. And that seems to me to be strange. If we've got all these forces there, and if people know, if you commit an act of violence, the Americans are there, watch out. And yet, that doesn't seem to be deterring anyone. And yet we talk about a war on terror. So I think it's kind of striking in this report that, we're looking at so much of this happening in one place, Afghanistan. And why that one place? If you look on a map, we've talked about this a little bit before, and you see the countries that border Afghanistan and the region in which it's situated, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense. Because within hailing distance of Afghanistan, right, we've got Iran, which means we've got Iraq and the tension between the two of them. We've got Pakistan, which is a arguably failing state with nuclear weapons, which means we drag in India. Okay. Russia's not that far away, and they, fought for 10 years there. Okay. So this is a part of the world that is geostrategically important and over which people have contested actually for centuries. Okay. But other than that, when we look at these things, most of you probably, if you get, just whatever your source of news is, or if you have one, might think, well, yeah, terrorism is this constant threat, and the United States has constantly to be doing all these things, otherwise terrorists will come and get us. Would this article suggest that that kind of fear is warranted? Is that legitimate? Does America really have much to fear from terrorism, according to this article? Would you get that impression from reading this, is what I'm asking you?
Probably, based on the reading, probably not.
Okay.
Because didn't you say before that they are not really posing, as an existential threat?
Well, they can't. No, clearly they don't. But there are other threats besides a fundamental existential threat. COVID is not an existential threat to the United States, but clearly it's a concern. It's dangerous. So I don't mean to suggest that, oh, well, the terrorists, they're just, you give them a beer, they're all right, Obviously, we have a problem here. What I'm trying to have you think about here is, when we look at an article like this, and Nanako did a great job of summarizing the data. Micah has really helped us understand the larger issue, at least and Micah's right, according to this perspective. The larger issue is essentially one, not so much of, man, terrorism is busting out all over, but that this is a consequence primarily of weak and failing states. Okay, and that was what I was kind of waiting for. It's a little buried. The lead is a little bit buried in this, but that is something that's really important with terrorism in the 21st century. It is a consequence, and this perspective is consistent with that, although I would agree with Micah, they're not very clear about it. Micah, I think that's what you were saying. But this is a byproduct or a consequence of weak states and failing states. It is really what Nanako suggested. It's a question of power, and power is derived from a sense of legitimacy. The state is legitimate, terrorism tends not to thrive. I mean, look at the United States. Everybody's getting all upset about white supremacy and violence and a plot to kidnap a governor and things like this. Yes, those things are upsetting. None of them is an existential threat to the United States. And you'll notice almost never does anything like that work. It's because whatever the current state of cynicism in the United States might be right now, or naivete or ignorance or whatever it is, most people have confidence that the government's going to protect them. Most people. I would suggest a critical mass of Americans still trust, whether they should or not, they still trust the government, they still trust the police, they still trust, more importantly, the rule of law. That's because we're not a failed state, okay? And we're not a particularly weak state in that sense. Does that make sense? Remember when we were talking about states and nation states and all that? It comes back into this notion of terrorism, where you have a weak state that can't respond to the demands of people, you're much more likely to see terrorism. Not only is that a cause of terrorism, but that's where it's most likely to happen. Okay, what else can we learn from this? We've got time. You're doing really well here. This is interesting.
So basically what I was going on is that even though like the attacks have been deadlier, but there have been a decrease in attacks, like compared to 2014, that was like when there was a peak. Overall, there was a 23% global decrease compared to it. Exact number in 2017, there was 8,584, and 70% of these came from like those areas surrounding Afghanistan, like you said. They come from Pakistan, Philippines, India, and Iraq. I know the article, I have down that a lot of these attacks did come from weakened and failed states. And another reason a decrease in the attacks is because Al-Qaeda at the time is trying to like rebuild Yemen, North Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Mm-hmm. So that is another reason for there could be a decrease in attacks.
So there's a kind of, you're suggesting then there's a kind of lull. We shouldn't conclude from that we're winning the war on terror. It might just be that people are regrouping.
Yeah, they're regrouping, but that also shows that their attacks that they're doing, they're making them at a larger scale, possibly.
Okay.
More people are dying from them.
Okay. There's one country in particular that really stands out here, because so far we've been talking about what we used to in the vernacular refer to as third world countries or developing countries. But there's one that really jumps out and has had a dramatic increase in terrorist attacks. And that's the UK.
Yeah.
We can't accuse them of being a failed state. You know, Boris Johnson notwithstanding, you know, if we can survive Donald Trump, they can survive Boris Johnson, and they're doing it, right? So they're not a failed state. The fundamental institutions of governance are still more or less cranking along. And yet they've been making the news quite a bit over the last 2 years. Now, remember, this report is from 2017, but most of these same trends are pretty much there. They're still, even though we're 3 years on, they're still there. What's going on in the UK? Did you get any sense from that? If you didn't, I understand why, because they just kind of drop it in there.
Yeah, they kind of just gave numbers to give like the class like exact numbers. Like in 2016, they had like a 356% increase in deaths, like from 9 to 40.
Actually, 2017 was the increase over 2016. But even in raw numbers, this is why it's so dramatic. One of the reasons why it's so high is in 2016, 9 people were killed by terrorist attacks in a country of tens of millions of people. But the very next year, it was 40. Do I have that right?
Yeah, 41. Yeah.
40. Yeah. Okay. Now, you might say, well, gee, that's not a very big number. I mean, you lose that many people on highways every day or whatever. but it's the idea that they're targeting people in a Western country, a former major colonial power, a country with strong active ties to the Middle East, that was involved in the creation of Israel and all these other kinds of things. I mean, can we guess why it might be that we don't say the same thing about the United States, for example? 40 people didn't die in 2017 to terrorist acts in the United States. Nothing like. There are very few terrorist attacks, international or, from outside the United States. We kill ourselves with high frequency. We kill each other, right, with high frequency. But people don't come from other countries, come here and kill us in very big numbers. That's why 9/11 was such a shock. In the better part of one day, we lost almost 3,000 people. Okay, but that's unusual. That's an aberration. That did not become the new normal. The world did not change, as everyone said. But something happened in the UK. What's going on there? Or we just, okay, Micah, you want to take a go at that?
Yeah, could it be an increase in refugees? Like I hate to say it, but an increase in refugees from the Middle East could.
Why do you hate to say that?
Say again?
Why do you hate to say that?
Because I don't want to draw a conclusion that is a very, like in America, just the conclusion can be like, oh, well, you let these people in and see what happens type thing.
Okay,
so,
well, we're going to assume that you're not a bigot, right? We're going to assume.
I just want to try that.
No, I'm serious, man. I mean, you shouldn't worry about that. I think everyone here should assume we're just trying to get at this thing. We're not trying to blame people. We're trying to explain, right? So no, that's okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I would say is the increase in refugees. It could be a potential cause because the U.S. has been pretty close to that idea, and Europe at large has been pretty open to that idea and welcoming people. And so I think when you put potential reasons is when you put people with different ideologies in a Western world where they don't agree with, and the UK freedom of speech, that type of thing. You see it in France as well with satirical messages that are published for freedom of speech. Then people that are refugees that migrate over there, they then don't agree with it and sometimes act out in causing attacks.
Yeah, that's a kind of hypothesis that a lot of people have about recent increases in terror insofar as we've seen them in Europe. Is a lot of it is a response to the destabilization of the Syrian civil war and this massive outflow of people. Okay, and a lot of those people came to Germany, and Germany has seen a slight uptick in that kind of violence, but nothing like the UK. Part of that is Germany has a more repressive society. Germany has more of a they have a stronger state in the sense of that. Now, Britain's moving in that direction, right? Britain uses a lot of CCTV. There's a lot of surveillance in the UK, particularly in London. You can hardly go anywhere where there aren't surveillance cameras and things, okay? And they use those all the time. Part of that is they don't have the same constitutional guarantees of privacy and speech and things that the United States has. You don't have an uncontested right to free speech in the UK the way you arguably do in the United States. And so, the government can shut you down a lot easier in a place like the UK than they can here. Another problem, and Micah mentioned France in particular, is North Africans, particularly in and around Paris, right? That has been an issue for a long time. Micah, do you want to speak to that? Because that's kind of your turf. You know that part of the world really well.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, just recently there was a decapitation of a teacher in France, showing a caricature of Muhammad on the basis of free speech. So yeah, there's a lot of people that come into France, in particular from North Africa, because it's the same language, more or less. So Morocco is like a big country that immigrates from North Africa into France. There's people from southern, like Madagascar. There's people from all over Africa that migrate into France because it's the same language for the most part. Like people in Africa, they have a national language of French frequently.
Former French colonies, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So then when they go somewhere that is a state where they feel safer, where there's not internal wars and whatever, then they seek comfort, right? And part of comfort is going somewhere where that you already know the language and that you can hopefully adapt quickly. But yeah, there's been an increase in attacks. I mean, you look at the Paris shooting that happened in like 2014, 2015. And then you have the attack in Nice the year after. You have Charlie Hebdo. Then you have this decapitation. There's other ones that happen actually just in Lyon. A couple of weeks ago, there was like some riots and whatever. So it's been a up and up issue for sure.
And again, you know, would you consider these people to be terrorists?
The mass attacks, is that like the people that are attacking, would I consider them to be terrorists? Like who are these people?
Well, no, the people, you know, in other words, the attacks that you're talking about, would you consider those to be like, would you consider a riot an act of terror?
No, I mean, especially not in France, because France is very like they're the number one in protest. Like they kind of take pride in it. It's almost like a hobby for them. Is like, yeah, I love protesting. So you know, protesting, rioting, I wouldn't say is particularly an act of terrorism in France. I think that once you get into physical harm attacks, that's where you get into terrorism.
And what's the grievance, as far as you can tell? I mean, you know, is it really religion? Is it just religion?
I mean, I'm not French fully, and I don't live there all the
No,
time.
I know, but you've been to the country and you understand the language and you have an insight into it. If I'm, you know, I mean, I don't mean to drag you out and on a limb or anything. If you're not comfortable, that's cool. But one of the things that's chronically a problem, particularly with North Africans in Paris, is a disproportionate number of them live in slums and they've been ghettoized. You know, I mean, there's grinding generational poverty and a tremendous amount of racism and religious bigotry and all kinds of things. So again, we're not talking about justifying decapitations and things like that. That's not what we're saying. We're not looking for blame, but when we look for explanations, suddenly religion's going to be there. I mean, the Crusades were not about religion as much as they were about territory and treasure. Okay, but they wouldn't have been carried out in the same way without religion, without the impetus of the blessing of the Pope and, you know, the notion of you know, Christian soldiers and stuff like that. So religion has been used to mobilize people for war for centuries. But it's surprisingly seldom the actual cause of things when you look beneath, you know, the notion of conflict. A realist, for example, is probably not going to talk as much about religion as they are blood and treasure. They're going to say it's about people being tied to land. It's about people wanting to, you know, assert their power over their adversaries, kind of like Nanako's talking about with terrorists. In other words, we don't have sufficient power to engage in conventional warfare with you. We don't have recognized diplomats. We don't have a state. This is what's called asymmetrical warfare. That's what terrorism is. We use the only weapons we have, okay? And they're horrific weapons, just like all weapons really are when you get right down to it, okay? This is a really good analysis, though. I think you guys nailed it pretty well. I got this in partly because it is a little bit of a frustrating article. It's kind of tantalizing. They give you some information, but they don't take their analysis very far. And that's why I offered it to you. Any more questions for the group or comments on the presentation or anything? I think that was quite good. Nothing else? Boy, you guys are getting off easy. All right, are we ready then to talk about climate change? That's a happy thing.
I think so.
Okay. Let's do that. Do you have a order in which you want to go or a way you want to take this on? How do you want to do it?
So like we discussed with our like in our little group, I don't know. I was just like, I did a bit of like an overview of the whole kind of thing because the article in itself is it's like an overview of it comes from like an overview of the book.
Mhm.
So it's just like the first like beginning part of it. And so it's introducing, you know, what this book is all about, the people who contributed to the book and like their ideas and whatnot. But it was just like, I don't know, it was like just a big old overview. But it said like near the beginning how this book / the article that we are reading or that you can read, it seeks to provide complementary understanding of how and why the international community must seek to reevaluate understanding of climate change and, you know, how to go about that and whatnot. And it asks this question and it tries to answer this question through the viewpoints of sociology, law, and psychology.
Okay, let's
as well.
clarify though. You're assuming. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No, you're good.
you're arguing that the article is sort of posing a question, and then attempting to answer it.
Yeah.
What's the question? As concisely as possible, because this is a good way of doing this. If you can analyze any kind of material like this in terms of, well, what's the question they're posing or implying, and then what's their answer to the question if they have one. That's sometimes a good way to get a grasp on what someone's trying to teach you. What question are they trying to answer? You kind of just did it, but frame it more clearly as a question.
Yeah, so I guess the question would be like, how does, you know, international relations play a role in climate change, and then like vice versa, just like what is the relationship between the two. At least that's what I got from it.
Okay.
Maybe that's a bit broad.
Now, what about you? Before we go any further, are your colleagues in general agreement on that that's kind of the task of the article? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not trying to call anybody out. I just want to make sure that if there's anything else anybody wants to throw in, you can do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so that's, I don't know, kind of in the most broad term, like the most simple terms. And then with that, at least the article, one thing I did kind of enjoy is they laid it out like pretty open, like pretty out there. Like, this is what we're going to be talking about. There's always a little blip of like, this is what we're talking about. And then here are the people that, you know, added their points to it. Like with the first section, it was, the main point was like how realism, liberalism, and constructivism, among other things, how those things, you know, play a role in our understanding of like climate change adaptation on a global view, on a global scale. And then from that,
can I interrupt you there? Because since you're right on, and you're in the text, one of the quotes here that's interesting, but I'd like to hear your group's interpretation, is the phrase, "Climate change is the poster child of global diplomacy today." What does that mean? Climate change is the poster child of global diplomacy today. And by the way, do you see why I wanted you first to learn what realism was and some of these other models of international relations? Because this is the way these things are done. These are the templates people use to analyze them. But what do they mean by a poster child of global diplomacy? When somebody says that something is the poster child for something, what do they mean? What does that expression mean? It's kind of a clunky old expression. It's funny to see it used, but
It kind of feels like instead of being taken seriously, it's kind of like used as this kind of talking point or a way to bring countries together.
Well, that's sort of taking it seriously, though, isn't it? If you're trying to use it to bring people together.
I guess it's making it to be less complicated than it actually is.
Yes, yeah. And they go on to kind of clarify that. That's good. In other words, it's sort of like, oh yes, everything we do in diplomacy is going to be in the context of, you know, what we have to do about climate change. But it's a gross over. Is that what you're saying? It's a gross oversimplification.
Yeah, it's like kind of making it seem like it's just climate change. It's not all these complicated things that come with that or that it's part of.
Yeah.
Basically.
Okay, so first point, I think, in terms of takeaway for this, is that one of the implications here is that for example, among realists. An important component of realism is negotiation, but you always negotiate from a position of strength. The problem with climate change is the intricacies that are involved in that often compel people to concede some of their strength by entering into alliances like the Paris Accord, right? That actually takes away, every time you enter into an alliance, you lose some measure of your sovereignty. You still may gain something from it, but it's a calculation that from a realist point of view, that every state has to calculate. How do I do this? Well, that complicates everything. Suddenly it's not merely, as Eliza said, it's not just climate change. It's, well, wait a minute. Does climate change mean that that's going to hurt our economy? You hear Donald Trump, for example, all the time, and many Republicans saying the whole Paris Accord, all that, he said this at the G20. He actually said this in a speech. This was just a way to destroy, he used the word destroy the American economy. That's, I think, is that what you mean when you say it covers up a lot of complexities about climate change and about diplomacy?
Yeah, that's kind of like also a little bit like saying it's all about America now.
But again, that is one of the things that clearly has complicated global responses to climate change.
Yeah.
If America's not on board, it's hard to think that it's going to happen.
Right.
Okay. What else? That's good. I like that. What else? What else can we learn from it? I know it's a long article, but we're just giving it a flyover.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things is don't oversimplify, right? Okay. That's good to learn. What else?
One thing that I saw, one of the biggest points that I saw in the article was kind of the free market versus the government intervention section. And it kind of leaned more towards the government intervention and policy and kind of opposed the free market stuff. But the free market kind of consists of private companies using methods to combat the climate change, which is usually like for a profit. One example
can you give us an example of that? What a free market approach to climate change would be?
Yeah, so there's a company, it's like REDD. I don't know if it's just pronounced red, but they used deforestation and carbon trading and privatized like their water supply. And the idea is that if companies do all this stuff, then they're going to get money, which basically leads to more incentive for more companies to do it. So the idea is that if there's more incentive, then more private companies will work towards trying to combat an idea. And then the government intervention part is kind of just a coalition of governments or one government kind of creating policy to combat the climate change. And the article definitely leaned more towards the social and environmental change through the government as opposed to the free market. So yeah.
Why do you think they would? What seemed to be their reasoning for it, insofar as you could tell?
They said it was pretty, they didn't say the words evil, but I kind of got from the article that's pretty evil to use resources as commodities like water supply and other stuff like that for money, and they think it should be more of a, not really sure, more of a world effort instead of a private kind of for money effort, if that makes sense.
Well, does it have to be evil in order to be something we shouldn't do? Do we have to go to the lengths of invoking what is essentially a kind of mythic moral rejection of something? It's evil, as opposed to, no, it doesn't fit with the proper way to respond to what is a global phenomenon.
Yeah, I guess I kind of meant more capitalistic versus social.
Yeah, because capitalism has a lot of problems, but it's hard to say in any meaningful sense, well, capitalism's evil. I mean, capitalists might behave in evil ways. That doesn't make capitalism evil. It might make it a system, though, that can't solve certain problems. Okay.
Right.
Okay, one of the things I would suggest, you're onto a really important thing here, though. Okay, that's good that you brought that out, is that one of the problems with trusting the private sector is that they will, as Cade suggested, they're going to try to commodify and monetize whatever it is that they're going to do. Okay. And they're going to do that according to this article. One of the problems is that the tendency is to do that at the expense of the very thing they're trying to save, which is the global ecosystem. because climate change isn't just a problem of, it's not like just simple pollution, to put it grossly. Well, the air is bad. It's like, no, we're going to destroy the planet. Why? Because we're wrecking the ecosystem. Okay.
Mhm.
You don't fix the ecosystem with massive deforestation, you know, and things like that. You know, it might make you a lot of money. You don't save the ecosystem by the United States becoming the world's major oil producer. Okay. Yeah. Is it profitable? Yes, it is. Will it help us deal with climate change? No, it won't. But not only that, it's going to further compromise the integrity of the entire global ecosystem, because for one thing, it's going to burn up quicker than it should. You know, what limited sources of petroleum we have, they are finite. But also, it's going to, if anything, it's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. And it's going to perpetuate the idea that an economy is dependent on commodification and monetization of resources rather than some other way of considering how to deal with it. So this is why they're coming down on the side of saying, no, this should be something that transcends profit motive. Profit motive isn't sufficient for this, I think. Caden, that sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was kind of the gist of it. I think
Yeah,
that
I think that's a good point. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, the article kind of said that if there's a combined effort with multiple governments, like kind of put I can't speak, emphasis on that, on like a coalition as opposed to a single government. But yeah, overall they definitely were more leaning towards the government intervention than the private sector.
Okay. All right, I get that. That's probably, those are most of the key points. Is there anything else that you thought, well, wait a minute, you know, there's one more thing here that's kind of important according to the authors? Or is that a pretty good summary? What do you think?
Well, there's also the discussion of, I mean, along with that is like also how like it's hard to switch over to other types of energy when businesses are making so much money off of things that harm the earth. And then there's also like the talk of how like there's all these different scales in which things are being decided, and like the international scale is different than the scale of like the people that are being affected by the actual problems, things like that. But I think that probably encompassed like most of it.
Those are really important points, though, and I was kind of hoping we'd air some of that out. That that was a good save, because I mean the group wasn't in trouble, but yeah, those are really important things, and they have a lot to do with other things we've looked at over the course of the term. You know, the idea that think about the terrorism approach. In some ways, there are decisions that can be made at a more local level that might have an impact on that, but ultimately, it's borderless. You know, I mean, terrorism's going to go where terrorism's going to go. It's going to go wherever the advantage of asymmetrical warfare can be realized, which is visibility. Pay attention to us, listen to us. Similarly, as you're suggesting with climate change, you know, there are things that, as Caden was saying, that say alliances of countries can do. It's problematic to go from a major energy source to another major energy source in the short run and in a practical way. And so one of the things that has to happen is, well, it has to be cost effective. One of the rejections of, you know, green energy used to be it's too expensive per kilowatt, you know, and there's insufficient storage, you know. Well, those, by the way, those problems used to obtain with things like gasoline. Gasoline used to be dumped. There was no use for it before internal combustion engines, because it was considered to be like liquid dynamite. It was just dangerous. That's why the rivers in you know, various parts of the Rust Belt used to burn. They would dump that stuff in the rivers. Okay, so the idea is it takes governments to do things like subsidize these emerging alternative energy sources, the way we've been subsidizing petroleum for 100 years, by the way, and we have, okay, in order for that to gradually deal with, you know, the challenge that Eliza is suggesting here of, well, we're going to switch energy sources. We've got to make that cost effective to consumers or they won't do it. We're seeing that, for example, with the use of photovoltaics and things like that, with people moving over to solar panels on their houses and stuff. The government comes along and says, I'll tell you what, as an incentive for you to do that, because the initial outlay is going to be expensive, we might give you a subsidy, like if the state of California, but also we'll give you a tax break. We'll let you get that money back on, on your taxes over a year or 5 years or whatever, right? You can write that off as an expense investing in the environment. That's only a decision that only a government can do. A private company can't do that. And it gets back to Caden's point of why government solutions have to be a part of the response. Is there a role for the private sector in this? And if there is, what do you think it is? Or is it just, no, this has got to be just governments. This has got to be global socialism.
They did bring up someone, I'm looking through my notes, but they did bring up how it takes both to do it, because if it's too much of just the private sector, then they can splinter off, and then the whole becomes not as strong to get there's strength in numbers,
right?
But if it's all big government like doing whatever, then there may not be.
I guess what I'm asking, Kennedy, is what does the private sector bring us that the state might not have?
Well, I'd say probably better quality things.
Well, not always. There is, though, one thing related to that the private sector tends to have that governments don't. The private sector tends to be more agile about innovation and new products, new solutions. Governments are slow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to supersede our next group, but one classic example of that is essentially a public-private partnership over COVID, not only within the United States, but globally. You can argue that never would have worked without big pharma coming in and saying, we're going to take all this intelligence that we have, all these apparatus that we have, all these institutions. The government's going to help us, but we're going to innovate. We're going to try things governments don't know how to do. Okay. Well, the same thing they're implying here, Kennedy, I think this was your point. The same thing, the energy and innovation of the private sector, the oversight and regulation and stability of the government working together might be the best way to do this. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And another thing that was in like that section, talking about all of that, is how it's important for both to have that balance. So then it's more of a quote like horizontal network rather than a hierarchy.
Right.
So then like everybody knows what's going on. So then like I don't know, communication is a lot clearer. So then things can get done.
Yeah, things can get done more efficiently because there's less redundancy. You don't have people working at cross purposes. You have transparency, all the things that you need to do something efficiently. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. This is a long, complex article, and I really do think you did a good job of, with only a little bit of prompting of kind of going in and figuring out, well, wait a minute, what are our takeaways here? Okay. Just on balance, would you say that this article is this is totally subjective. I'm asking for your opinion. Would you say that on balance, it impresses you as being optimistic or pessimistic going forward? Or can you really tell?
Personally?
Yeah, just your response to it.
Yeah, I think it does an all right job of showing kind of both sides, but it's I think overall it's more of we'll see what like this is what needs to happen, or like this is the author's opinion is like this is what needs to happen, like we'll see if it does, like the potential is there, but we'll see.
Because of the same complexities that Eliza was pointing out, that if we oversimplify and we make it a mere poster child kind of thing, if we keep doing that, then we won't be able to realize these things as these horizontal, complex, integrated operations, and we will fail.
Exactly.
So is it would you say it's kind of cautionary? Like, hey, you better listen to these things, because if you don't, you will fail?
I would say so, yeah. I don't know
Okay.
about either two.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? It's just, sometimes I just like to hear your personal reactions to things. This is a pretty complex one. All right. You know what? We still have enough time. If we take on, and of course we can, because, you know, we're efficient and transparent. If we take on global health, then that leaves us with only 2 to do on Wednesday, which means for sure we'll be done on Wednesday. Do you still have enough energy to do that, or do we need to kind of regroup and come back and try to do 3 on Wednesday? I'm going to leave it up to you. What do you think? See how democracy can fail?
This is, I don't know, I feel like this is a selfish reason, but I've got another class right at 12. So if it were to go over, then I need to get to that class. I don't know if that's anybody
Well, you could
else.
always bail if you had to. I understand that. You know.
Okay. If that's good with you, then I'm fine.
Well, any other thoughts on that? What do you think? Because then that means we definitely would have to take more time on Wednesday.
I'm fine doing it now, but
Is the group ready? What are the thoughts of the group? Because let's see, there I think are 4 of you. As a group, you're pretty much ready to go? Let's see how we go. If we hit a wall and we feel low energy, you can always finish up on Wednesday. Let's do it. I don't think it's going to take that long.
so we have international governance and global health pandemics, and our article is chiefly expository. It's focusing on the origins and apparatus of the international governance of those pandemics. So I'm not entirely sure which direction you want us to take with that, but
well, I'm leaving it up to you. What I'm most interested in is, as a group, when you read this, did anything strike you as, you know what, we need to talk about this. They're raising this point, and this point is important.
well, I think the origins of it are somewhat interesting in that it's coming out of the cholera epidemic in Europe in the early 19th century, and that the driving force for creating these international communities together to deal with these diseases is its hindrance to international commerce, and that being the driving force as opposed to maybe more health-oriented things. But it's the money that matters in that particular early instances, and even later into the 20th century with the once they create the International Office of Public Hygiene, where they first lay out the perhaps key bit of the global governance, which is that if a disease shows up in any one of these member countries, they have to notify the rest of them. But it's, in that instance, it's very specific diseases, but it's the fact that what they exclude from there is influenza, because they argue it's impractical to contain, since there's no quarantines that they effectively could do it without limiting the global commerce. Yeah.
Well, and we found that to be the case, though, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. We have. I did not deny that.
Yeah.
It's simply that it's interesting to notice that the global commerce is the driving force.
Well, you can think about that in a couple of ways, I guess. One of them would be a sort of moral rejection of that by saying, aren't people more important than the economy? We've sort of nationally had a very bad example of that discussion in our media and everything. Another way to think about it, though, is, I'll give you a great example, right? We took a significant pay cut as a consequence of COVID, right? The only problem with that is, instead of averaging that out over the entire year, which what I got hit this month with a big chunk of it. Let's just, I'm going into December here. And, I could actually spend all the money I have, including my savings this month, because of being hit by COVID. Well, that's because of interruptions in commerce that are affecting the viability of public universities. That's a kind of commerce. I mean, any buying and selling and goods and services is a part of commerce. So you could say, well, yeah, if you interrupt commerce, people lose their jobs. You can break an economy. If you break an economy, people are going to starve. So the part of it is that thing of, yeah, we don't care about people, we just want to make money. But also it's the idea that, wait a minute, what keeps people going? Commerce.
Well, it wasn't necessarily a moral criticism I was making.
No,
was just
it wasn't with you.
observation.
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying a lot of people take that as a moral argument and say, well, why should we? Well, I don't care about businesses. Closed businesses, we have to save lives. And I think what they're trying to get at here is it's not an either or choice. You want to save lives, you also have to save the economy. I mean, part of the Republican argument against this right now in the United States is, as a consequence of these lockdowns or whatever you want to call them, and the hit that people have taken in employment, we've seen this rise in opioid addiction and things like that. Part of that, by the way, is anecdotal. No one's really looked that hard at the data because this has been a problem for the last 10 to 15 years. And drug addiction in the United States has been a problem for the last century. Okay, so it's hard to argue that this is happening just because of COVID. But, when you take people out of their job and they're dependent upon the government, they can have a sense of a loss of self, a loss of dignity, or whatever. If that happens at a large scale, which can happen in a pandemic, you can actually really undermine the mental health of people, which is part of, it's part of the human experience, right? But you're right. I mean, I think that's a really great summary of when you look at this, it's a way of trying to stabilize the world. It really is. To just sort of commercially and geopolitically stabilize the world. It need not be merely about human compassion, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? It doesn't have to be motivated by compassion? Because I think that's basically. Yeah. Okay, what else? That's one thing to keep in mind with all of this is that, sometimes when you hear bureaucrats speaking or you hear health professionals speaking and they're really being honest, they might not sound that compassionate, but they're trying to say the things that need to be said. And when you hear economists talking, it doesn't mean that they're heartless people. It means that their view of the world is if you break an economy, you break a people. What else?
Another interesting point in the article is how they talk about one of the first influenza strains that the WHO really had to deal with was SARS. And they were able to get that handled in 4 to 5 months, really, with the spread. And it seems like that was because people really trusted what the WHO was saying at the time and was following the practices, which is, I'm not sure, exactly the case today.
Well, what you're saying is true up to a point. The problem is that SARS isn't COVID, and COVID is a lot more formidable. But it is a fair point that, one of the things I was hoping someone would connect to is early on in the term, when we were just looking at global trends, one of them was globalization, okay? And we were talking about the consequences and impact of globalization, okay? And, when we expand the capacity, as Tristan suggested, if we're just thinking about expanding the capacity for global commerce, right? We don't often stop to think about what else that brings with it. So, the arguments about terrorism, a lot of the arguments about terrorism are, this is a rejection of globalism. This is a rejection of the globalization of culture. That's why it appears to be just a religious thing. It's not just religious. It's like, this is the way we live. And when you begin to beam, American television in here and American capitalism and American this or Western this and Western that, you're attacking us. You're attacking our way of life, just like a virus would. Okay. But there's also real virus, there's real disease that increases as we globalize. Okay. And so, one of the things that's clear about this is that we've gone, as the pace of globalization has intensified, right? So too has the need for more globally oriented responses to these disease vectors and things, because, you can get sick in China and, 18 hours later, you can take that sickness with you to New York or San Francisco or wherever, or Seattle. Okay. That did not used to be the case. Just think about it. If we didn't have air travel right now, this would not have been the kind of pandemic that it has become. That's clear. Okay. And so part of this is part of the price you pay for globalization. I'm not disparaging globalization because this isn't about values and norms and morals. It's just, you want the convenience of I want the best price and the cheapest labor and whatever, the convenience that only globalization could give me. Thank you, Communist China, for giving me affordable consumer durables for the American middle class. I don't care about communism, and I also don't care about disease. I just want affordable iPhones. You know, I mean, we've made that kind of devil's bargain particularly over the last century, right? Haven't we? You know, do we ever really stop and think about what all that air travel is doing? And I think most of the time we don't. You know what made us think about it? When we thought about getting in a pressurized tube at 30,000 feet with a potentially deadly virus in there with us. Never mind the harm that that does to the environment and has done for the better part of a century. Most of us don't think about that. But this is globalization. This is how the world changes when we apply the genius of the species to convenience, to the pursuit of convenience. And as Tristan suggested, the commercialization of that pursuit of convenience is something that for which there is a vibrant, dynamic market. We'll pay a lot of money and we'll sacrifice a lot, or not think about that sacrifice, in order to have things be more convenient. That is not an American phenomenon. That's a global phenomenon, okay? What else?
I was just going to say, it seems like the WHO has done a decent job keeping pace with globalization, because in 2005, they released new measures that called for countries to communicate any serious health impacts to other countries. And then in 2011, they sent out a plan or a framework for influenza viruses being shared globally. So it seems like they're trying their best to keep up with the global world.
If we just look at COVID, one of the things that everyone's had to admit at every level of this, and certainly at the WHO, is, you know what? In a lot of ways, initially, we had this thing wrong. Yeah, it's a novel virus. We'd never seen it before. We get things wrong. But part of looking at, remember when I said before about bureaucracies and governments, is that they tend not to be very agile. They tend to be kind of slow. Okay. It's hard for a big agency to respond in a very nimble way to a sudden and unprecedented phenomenon. Like, oh, we've never seen this before. What do we do now? The fact that the WHO responded as quickly as it did, I think, is that what you're saying? It makes it look like, yeah, you know, on balance, they do a pretty good job.
Yeah, I'm saying just like the plans that they had enacted like years in advance allowed them to be like kind of prepared for a global instance.
Right. Yeah. In other words, they've done better because they've done better over the course of years rather than just weeks or months. Yeah, sure. That's a good point. And we often, again, it's part of that sort of chronic short attention span in terms of our speculations about things and our understanding of things. Most people didn't even know what the WHO was until COVID broke out. They'd heard of it, but they didn't know what it was or how it worked. And nobody knew who Anthony Fauci was. I remembered Fauci from AIDS, you know, under Reagan. And I've had my differences with the guy in a lot of ways because, as he's admitted, initially he got things wrong. That's the thing about science, man. You get things wrong. But if you keep scrutinizing, the idea is you get your feet back under you and you get it right. What I think Carson's suggesting is when you think of the things they developed, the protocols they developed, the various procedures they developed, they were working in the right direction. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, they were working in the right direction. It's just a whole new type of coronavirus or disease. So like they had to make changes on the fly, but the groundwork that they did have seemed like it, if all the countries would have followed and people would have listened, it seems like the framework that they had was decent.
Yeah, I mean, you can, I've just recently was looking at the published papers of the president. And, you know, there have been some things that suggested that, well, Obama should have known. And I thought, I had this recollection of hearing him in speeches, and I actually have to read that stuff. So I went back and found any number of times where Obama expressed that one of his real concerns going forward, right up there with, you know, whatever our concerns are about, you know, terrorism or anything else, was the outbreak of a global pandemic. That he was really concerned that the administration continued to be, you know, more agile and more nimble about being able to respond to these things. And that was why there were White House agencies that were created within the office, the White House office, meaning, by the way, as long as Congress funds it as White House office, the president can create any kind of agency within that he wants to. and one of them was for preparedness for pandemics. That was almost immediately closed down with the next administration to come in. So this is one of the problems that governments face. It's the same kind of complexity. Yes, that's right. Bush did feel the same way. That's a great point. In other words, there was a growing concern in America's leadership that, yeah, they understood, this is globalization. There's a lot of great stuff here, but it brings us face to face with terror. It brings us face to face with disease. It brings us face to face with lots of things that are going to be there, and they're inevitable because of the ultimate benefits of globalization. We better prepare for the downside of this. We better be nimble. We better develop protocols. We better do what the WHO is doing. Okay. And this is that, again, it's kind of like when we were talking about climate change. These are complex issues. They deal with national sovereignty. I mean, there is no body on the planet that can force America into a lockdown. There is no body in the United States that cavalierly, easily can force every American into a lockdown. The United States government, short of a declaration of a state of emergency, a comprehensive medical state of emergency, couldn't force us to take a vaccine, couldn't force us to wear a mask. I say couldn't, they could, but we've already seen the kind of resistance to that. We've made wearing masks political. Well, I don't think anybody thought a year ago that would be the case, that something as simple as doing what all of Asia does every flu season, wear masks when you're sick, would ever become a point of political contention in the United States. But it is now. It is now. Well, multiply that by every sovereign state on the planet, and suddenly you begin to see how, oh man, how are we going to deal with global health? We saw it with the outbreak of AIDS. It was very problematic. The United States, fortunately, once it got going, really took seriously a commitment to dealing with AIDS. But it took a long time. And the problem with something like a pandemic is you don't have a long time. You don't have a lot of time to respond. And you don't have a lot of time to get into pissing contests over whether or not you as an individual shouldn't have to wear a mask because you don't like the way it makes you look or something, or you think it's an infringement on your freedom. But the fact is, we do have those arguments. What else? I mean, that's pretty good. Is there anything else that jumped out at you? It's not a super long article. Did it raise any questions that it didn't answer for you? Sometimes that's an interesting way to think about an article. Did it leave any?
The only question I really had at the end of it was one of the last sentences is it talks about how travel bans and quarantine stuff is still being questioned by public health law experts. So that was the only little point that wasn't clear to me.
What's not clear about that?
Well, I don't know, the information seems like travel bans are good, but then experts have been questioning them according to the article, but it sounds like they're
public health law experts.
Yeah, I was about to say, I just saw that law
yeah.
word. So
no, that's an honest oversight. In other words, it's kind of what I was trying to talk about before, was there are going to be people who don't really have a public health dog in the fight, but their responsibility is, wait a minute, with respect to public health, what kind of legal power does the state really have? What kind of legal sovereignty, right, does the individual really have, or the community really have, where we can just say, sorry, in Ashland, we don't have to do these things. Well, yeah, you do. The reason why we're talking on a screen right now is not because, I wanted to do this. It's because the governor said we had to. We were way out in front of the state, SOU was. I think I mentioned this before, but I started developing these classes for online delivery early in February. Or late in January, sometime in there. I remember talking to my department chair and saying, should I, I'm going to go ahead and start prepping these things so we can put them online. And we thought we were way ahead of the curve. Within a couple of weeks, like by March 18th, right, we were sort of told, okay, spring term's online. Well, we were ready to go, right? A rare example of a public entity being nimble. But the problem is there were all kinds of legal issues over that. And one of them was, can we require the faculty to come back and teach? you know. And my response to that was, look, I got a 96-year-old father. I'm responsible for going down there several times a month to help take care of him. I don't want to run the risk of making him sick. But technically, I'm not a regular healthcare giver because I don't live there, you know. So there's all these kinds of complex issues that have to do with, you know, my right as the son of my father to help take care of him when he's almost 100, right? As opposed to the public need for, you know, for health. So that's what was going on there. It was the idea that, you know, these things are still an open question in terms of what the actual legitimate authority of public law is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Our group was saying too that the article was written in March, so we are wishing it was written a little later, so we had more COVID information to talk about.
Yeah, I think Zachary popped up with that as well.
Yeah, I was just saying his comment.
Yeah, and that would have helped. But again, you know, I had to take the stuff that was available at the time I was writing the class, so you know, I couldn't get anything more current. But all right, anything else? See, I told you we could get 3 of these things in. Look at that. Look at you being all efficient intellectuals, you know? I thought that was well done. I mean, you know, I think every one of those presentations had a lot of substance to it. This is the advantage of working on these things as a group, though, is that one of you is going to catch what another of you might have overlooked, and that's going to be multiplied. So just so far, how do you think this went? Was it effective to have the breakout rooms and meet as groups and prepare for this?
That was very helpful.
Okay. All right. Can you suggest a way to do it better? Should I have given you more time, or should I have dropped in on the groups and helped you, or was it better for you to just work by yourselves?
The one thing I was going to say was if there was a way that we could all see each other's notes or something, or have a shared document.
Well, you could do a Google Doc.
That's
And
true.
my group is planning on sharing our notes. That's what we talked about when we were in the breakout room.
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, that's fine.
Mr. Hughes?
Yeah.
My group, we met 2 or 3 times on Zoom over the last week, putting ourselves together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, you can get as intense about this as you want. I can't require that, though. You know, I mean, it's a good way to do it. But what I'm trying to do is come up with a way where even if you don't want to meet outside of class, I give you enough time to meet together in class time so that you can prepare for this. But as far as sharing documents, that's a great idea. And Google Docs is one way to do that. There are others as well, but that's probably right now. What do you think? I think that's the most reliable way to do that. All right. Anything else? Okay. Overall,
Did you want us to send you our notes?
No, what I want you to do, and I don't want you to send me anything right now. I want you to hang on to your notes, because each of you is an individual, right? I want you, ultimately, you're going to develop your own interpretation of this article. That's going to be your assignment. And I'll have a little, I'll have a link on the Moodle page. It will not be due until next week. Okay. It'll be due let's say maybe next Thursday, because I got to have enough time to grade these things. But you got plenty of time to think about that. But when you do it, if you really want to nail this assignment, did you notice how many times I tried to refer back to concepts that we'd covered earlier in the class? I'd like you to try to do that. It's not the only way to do it, but if you really want to nail this thing going away and have your last assignment really pick your grade up, and you can show me that, you know what, some of these concepts we talked about 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks ago, I now understand how they work when I'm analyzing these ongoing challenges for globalization and everything. And if you can do that, then you're showing me what you've learned. Okay. It's not a final, though. You shouldn't think of it that way. But it is one way to approach this, because what I've been trying to do is give you gradually over the course of weeks a kind of conceptual vocabulary so that you have more precise and informative ways of thinking about these challenges and, you know, understanding them yourselves and explaining them to your friends and family and colleagues and whatever, right? And the international studies is about learning to do that. You know, how do I explain, you know, I get all these goofy text messages from people. I've had several people lately texting me asking, is the instability in sub-Saharan Africa right now related in any way to instability in the United States? And every one of them said, this is probably a dumb question. And it isn't. But the problem is they didn't have a vocabulary for, you know, a conceptual vocabulary for thinking about this horrific violence that's going on in Nigeria right now, or what's going on with the Tigray People's Liberation Front in Ethiopia. That we're going to find out, unfortunately, when that news blackout is lifted, if it ever is, that could become a killing fields in Ethiopia. That could be very dangerous. Remember that Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war for 30 years, and it was never covered on the news. Okay, but you know, these things aren't caused by the last 4 years of the United States or anything else, but they're related. Okay, they are clearly related. We've seen demonstrations in Nigeria that look a lot like Black Lives Matter. And that sounds silly because you think, well, wait a minute, that's, you know, this is an African country. Of course, Black Lives Matter. It's Nigeria. But no, I mean, in terms of saying to the police, right, in a country that much of whose independent history has been military dictatorship, you can't do that to us. There was a thing I mentioned before that's called demonstration effect. And if people, because of the globalization of media, see how other countries respond to repression, they often learn from that. You know, when you think of the Occupy movement in the United States, it's kind of hard to argue that that wasn't in part influenced by the Arab Spring, which immediately preceded it. Okay, that's demonstration effect. That's why social media or any media becomes so important. You know, they can globalize these phenomena much more quickly now. Okay. All right. Anything else? We'll talk again about the specifics of the assignment when we meet on Wednesday. I've got a link up there that I'm still revising the description. I want to hear all the presentations before I finalize that, though. But maybe, you know, within a day or so of Wednesdays, I'll have a chance to. I'm trying to write the description based on what you emphasize in the presentations to try and help you a little bit. All right. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you on Wednesday and then you'll be done, essentially, other than your last assignment, which should be pretty straightforward. Anything
I want
else?
to tell everybody good job on their presentations.
I thought they were great.
job,
I'm
guys.
really pleased. All right. See you on Wednesday.
Bye.
You.